This is for learning and cognition, and we're covering Chapter 7, Cognitive Development Through the Lifespan. So the question is, what is development? Rousseau was a believer that overall humans are good-natured beings. He attributed all creatures have this instinctual drive towards self-preservation. That human beings therefore would have such a drive, he termed it amour de soi, or self-love. This self-love directs us first to attend to our most basic biological needs for things like food, shelter, as well as warmth. However, Rousseau also seen humans, like other creatures, are a part of this design of a benevolent creator. And they are individually well-equipped as well as means to be able to satisfy their natural needs. With this basic drive for self-preservation, Rousseau theorized that people's passion, which he termed petit or compassion, this compassion directs us to attend to and try to relieve that suffering that happens from others. And then it's not only just humans, but that animals do this as well. And so that we can do so much this without danger to our own self-preservation. In some of his writings, like within the Second Discourse, compassion is seen as an original drive that would sit along with self-love. And besides this, he found that it is a development of that self-love that's considered to be the origins within all of our passion. Now, Rousseau's ideas about education is mainly coming from work that he did called The Meal. And he posited that the idea of negative education is a form of child-centered education, which this essential idea is about education being carried out so far as possible within a harmonic form of development for a child's natural capabilities by a process of an autonomous discovery. Now, this would actually be in contrast to a model of education in which the teacher is a figure of authority that's conveying knowledge and skills according to a predetermined curriculum. Rousseau, he depended on the fact that natural goodness, which he assessed to being that educational schema, involves the protection as well as development of the child's natural goodness through various types of stages, along with the isolation of a child from the domineering wills of others. This goes all the way up into adolescence, at least in terms of an educational program that would comprise of sequence of manipulations of the environment by the tutor. Now, the child is not going to be told what to do or think, but instead they're led to draw out their own conscious draw upon their own consciousness, their conclusions, as well as result in its own explorations, his or her own explorations. That context for which has been carefully arranged. So pretty much the development will go in the first stage of the program. It'll start, of course, within infancy. And Rousseau felt that this is a crucial point to be able to avoid conveying that idea that human relations are basically of one domination or subordination. And it's also the idea that can easily be fostered into an infant by the conjunction of its own independence on parental care, as well as the power to get attention by crying and so forth. So, though a young child must be protected from physical harm, Rousseau felt that it gets used to the exercise of its bodily powers and then therefore advises that a child should be left as free as possible in being able to explore and not be confined or constrained. So from the age of pubescence, 12 or higher, here the program would then move on to the acquisition of being able to get abstract skills as well as concepts. And it's not done with the use of books or formal lessons. Instead, it's through practical type of experiences. Now, the third phase of education, that will coincide more with puberty and move on into early adulthood, in which this period of isolation would come to an end, and the child will begin to take interest in others, especially those that they are sexually attracted to, and in how he or she would be regarded. Now, it's during this stage that there's a huge danger that for in terms of excessive love or excessive self-love in trying to create it, it will extend into this exacting recognition from others, disregarding their worth, becoming more demanding subordinations. And this task of the tutor then would be to ensure that the student would pretty much their relations with others are going to be first mediated through the passion of compassion, so that through the idea of the suffering of others or the care or gratitude, the student will find a secure place for the recognition of his or her own moral worth, where his or her self-love can be established on a non-competitive type basis. Now, the final period of the education, this is involving more about the teacher changing from a manipulator of the child's environment into the adult's trusted advisor. The young and autonomous adult is now going to look out and seek a spouse or a partner in which another source of security is formulated, as well as non-competitive type of recognition. This final phase is also going to be involving instruction into the nature of the social world. This would include, in terms of Rousseau's belief system, doctrines of a political philosophy. Now, Martinez speaks about Rousseau's prescription for the dire state of view of the human condition, in that it's more of about a preserve as complete to the nature of the child. And pretty much it's those repressive forces that will be exerted by society as well as in institutions in which learning is occurring and taking place. This happens in the place of repression, and pretty much a child would need to have that freedom, as mentioned earlier, the freedom to be able to explore, to play, to ask questions, to be experiment. Think about how you might hear stories about parents talking about their child during when they're a toddler and they're exploring their bodies, and a lot of times parents are automatically making children feel that it's a taboo when they find themselves playing with their penis or playing with their vagina. They're automatically told no. Well, this is something in that same manner that you can think of. But with sufficient freedom, Rousseau, he felt that a child really could retain his or her original state of mobility. She or he could be, considered to be what is called a noble savage. And this is when society has been able to structure and be able to preserve the child's inner and original sense of goodness that would benefit humanity overall. So furthering on with perspectives on development, let's take a look at progressive education. This term has been used to describe ideas and practices that would aim to make schools more effective in terms of a democratic society. Sorry about that. Although there are numerous differences of style as well as emphasis among progressive educators, One thing is they share the conviction that democracy means active participation by all of its citizens in terms of social, political, as well as economic decisions that can help affect lives. Now, the education of engaged citizens in terms of this particular perspective would involve two elements. That being one, respect for diversity, meaning that each individual should be recognized for his or her own abilities, their interests, their ideas, needs, as well as their cultural identity. Secondly, the development of critical social and engaged intelligence, which allows us to be able to understand as well as participate effectively within the affairs of our communities in a collaborative type of effort to be able to achieve a common good. So these elements of progressive educations, there's a term, they've been termed child-centered as well as social reconstructivist constructivist approach. And while this is in term forms extreme, they've also been separated, particularly when we look at the thoughts of John Dewey as well as other theorists in talking about the necessity that's related to one another. So those progressive principles have been the predominant philosophy within American education itself. From the inception late in the 1830s, there's been a state of systems that's common to public schooling that's primarily been to attempt to achieve cultural uniformity. And when I say cultural uniformity, I'm not talking about diversity, okay? Um, you'll think of segregation in your head with that statement. But overall, the hope was to be able to educate dutiful as but not critical people. Additionally, schooling has been under a constant pressure to be able to support the ever-expanding changes that's entailed with industrial economy by establishing more competitive type of environments and preparing people to be able to take on more vocational type roles. So the term progressive came about from a period that starting back in 1890 through the 1920s that really looks at how Americans took more care at the political as well as social effects of mass concentrations of corporate power as well as private wealth. Now, Dewey, he kind of saw that the decline of the local community life as well as small scale enterprise and young people, they were losing a valuable opportunity to be able to learn the arts of democratic participation. His work concluded that education would need to be able to make up for this type of loss. So in his laboratory school that was at the University of Chicago, uh, he kind of tested these ideas with leading school reformers like Francis Parker and Ella Flagg Young. Now, between 1899 to 1916, he circulated his ideas in his work in the School and Society, The Child and the Curriculum, Schools of Tomorrow, as well as Democracy in Education. And then there was also numerous lectures and articles he wrote. So during this time, other experimental schools was established throughout the country, and Progressive Education Association was founded back in 1919. Their aim was to try to reform the entire school system here in America. Now, this this association was led by Dewey. Of course, he was into progressive education, and it opposed the growing national movement that sought to separate academic education for the few and narrow vocational training for the masses. So during the 20s, when education turned increasingly to more towards scientific techniques like IQ testing and benefit management, progressive educators started to insist on the importance of looking at the emotional, artistic, as well as creative aspects of human development. That the most living as well as essential part of our being as quoted by Margaret Nussbaum in The Child in the World. Now, the Great Depression came about, and a group of politically oriented progressive educators that was led by George Counts kind of dared the schools to try to build a new social order, so to speak. And they went on to publish The Social Frontier that helped advance the reconstructionist type of critiques of laissez-faire type of capitalism. Now, in Columbia University, the Teachers College, Kilpatrick, as well as other students that was taught under Dewey, kind of took the principles of progressive educations and spread it out to thousands of other teachers as other school leaders. And by the middle of the century, Dewey's work, including experience in education, as well as Boyd's progressive education at the crossroads, they kind of try to make the change in new challenges. And among others, it helped to continue to provide more progressive critique of conventional assumptions in terms of teaching and learning and academics. So this major research endeavor he took on, this here was about approximately 8 years of experiment. And what happened in the results were that students from progressive high schools shown to be more capable, more adaptable type learners, as well as being able to excel in post-education. However, by the 1950s, when the Cold War was creeping in and taking foothold, there was a lot more of anxiety as well as cultural conservatism, and progressive education was widely repudiated, and then it was disintegrated as an identical movement. But since then, a lot of different group of educators have really grabbed foothold again and rediscovered a lot of the ideas that John Dewey and his associates had. And they worked toward a revision because they knew that there was a need for change in schools and to be able to help the children in society today. So some of the things would be like open classrooms, schools without walls, or cooperative type learning, multi-age approaches, looking at the whole language, social curriculums, experiential type of education, and alternative schools. They became an important philosophical type roots for progressive education. John Goodland's, he had the notion in terms of a non-graded school, and that was introduced in the 50s, late 50s. Theodore Sizers came up with the essential schools, and then Whittington's Foxfire Project by Elliot Whittington. And then there was also others like Deborah Mayer's student-centered Central Park East schools. And these are just some examples about how progressive reforms in public education was coming about. So this is all led and done by the work of Dewey. His ideas that's more radical direction helped to give rise to a free school movement. More recently, you have activist educators that's found within urban areas that advocate a greater equity, justice, as well as diversity and other democratic values to try to help rethink about how schools are being conducted. And then there's the National Coalition for Education Activists who are also involved. So today you have a lot of scholars and educators as well as activists that's looking back at Dewey's work, and they're exploring different ways to show the relevance of a more postmodern age in terms of how global capitalism as well as cultural change impacts the ecological health, and as well as the threat of those things can be to our education system. And so we're seeing how Dewey was a visionary, so to speak, because his insights to having a more democratic culture as well as meaningful type of education really suggested that there should be hope in terms of being able to provide alternatives instead of just looking at standardization and mechanical notion uh, that's been at recent dominating our school systems. All right, so that talks about John Dewey and his work. Now, we've all heard about nature versus nurture, but just as a recap, we know that nature refers to the genes and hereditary factors that helps to influence who we are, from our physical appearance right down to our personality characteristics. And of course, nurture is talking about those environmental variables that help to shape who we are. That's including things that's occurring during early childhood, uh, like how we are raised, our relationships within the community and social relationships, as well as our culture. How does this play into our discussion of learning? With respect to genetics, work within the behavior genetics is started impact on education. And obviously, evidence has shown that heritability of differences in education achievement has been discovered. Heritability is again defined as that amount of variation in the behavior that will be explained through that genetic similarity. Heritability is either going to be inferred on the basis that achievement is going to be more similar to the genetic similarities of an individual, like the idea of the ability to run within the family. Like I always make claim that art is something that I inherited from my family because the majority of my family members demonstrate some type of artistic abilities. And it's where learning a different art has been generally easy for the majority of the family members. Or, well, is it measured directly by looking at correlative variations within the individual letters of a DNA, looking at, uh, how that impact our educational outcomes in large samples that will be looking through the variations in behavior that's explained by direct measures of DNA? Would it be 10% instead of the 50% that's explained in observing patterns that run in families? So during the last 5 years, think of it this way, there's been papers that's been published that shows heritability of educational achievement from 16 and up would be around 60%, and that controlling for IQ would appear to be the same genes that would explain variability in different academic disciplines. Now, that along with social mobility. So being able to measure children's achievement in higher education was able to present itself at approximately 50% heritable. That on genetic grounds showed little evidence, though, that selective schools would produce better educational outcomes than non-selective schools would, and that those educational achievements can be a causal protective factor uh, against certain diseases like Alzheimer's, for example. Now, in terms of the environmental influences, when we're talking more on the side of nurture, research has been focusing on the effects of the social economic status and how one of the environmental measures would show most predictive power on cognitive and educational outcomes. Social economic status is usually going to be measured by parental levels of education and income. That's saying that social economic differences in the cognitive abilities are going to be readily observable when children start school, and it tends not to narrow with age. We can even say it might be even larger. So, excuse me, I see I took my notes wrong, but let me go ahead and clear my head and start this part over. So, When we're talking about the greater effects of home than the school on cognitive ability, it would suggest that educational neuroscience would be the focus on developmental factors that goes beyond the classroom, and that SES would be a measure of the environment only as a proxy for actual experiences of the child. So that actual causal mechanism may operate along multiple pathways, as well as pathways that might differ depending on an absolute level of poverty that would be across different countries, as well as the level of inequality. So these pathways we can see as prenatal factors, talking about nutrition of the mother. Did the mother smoke? Alcohol consumption, stress, postnatal issues, uh, early caregiver sensitivity, any postpartum depression. The list can go on and on. And believe it or not, it does impact and affect how SESs um, can impact the overall education process as well as mental processes, because there is evidence of an uneven uh, cognitive profile, so to speak, with relative greater effects on language development, how our executive functionings are going, being that it'll be weaker, uh, particularly on visuospatial type of cognitions. And though there are reasons for this unevenness, we really don't exactly know all of it, and we have to show that it is a part of the process in terms of research. So, of course, we went through neuroscience last week, so I'm not going to go into every depth again because we talked about that last week. But moving on, look quickly at continuity versus discontinuity. Now, continuous development, we see development more as a cumulative process, meaning that changes are going to be more gradual in our development. Whereas discontinuous development, we see it more as taking specific steps or stages, and these changes are often sudden. So in psychology, we see learning has been more of discontinuous. Uh, we have theorists that's on the continuous side, but a lot of the research has been leaning more toward discontinuous, that we take steps to the process to process information. And we'll look at some of the theorists who sees it that way. So when we look at cognitive development, of course, we see no other but Jean Piaget. And of course, he is famous in psychology for his observations as well as intellectual contributions in terms of cognitive development of children. His theories, though, can also be useful in terms of learning. It's pertaining to the acquisition and processing of knowledge that clarifies ways that we process events and emotions surrounding our lifetime experiences. Some of the key concepts his theory revolves around are first schemas, and of course a schema describes both the mental as well as physical actions that's involved in understanding and knowing things. Schemas are categories of knowledge that helps us to interpret as well as understand the world around us. In Piaget's view, a schema includes both a category of knowledge as well as the process of obtaining that knowledge. As experiences happen, this new information is used to be able to modify, add to, or even change previously existing schemas. Now, one example can be that a child may have a schema about a type of animal like a dog. And if the child's sole experience has been with only small dogs, then the child can basically believe that all dogs will be small and tiny and furry and they all have 4 legs. However, let's suppose that the child will come in contact with a large dog. The child will take this new information and then begin to modify the previously existing schema to be able to include that new information. So in terms of when we speak about assimilation, this is the process of taking in new information into previously existing schemas, and the process is somewhat subjective. And that's because we tend to modify our experiences or information somewhat to fit our own pre-existing belief systems. So when we look at the child and how that child sees the dog, the labeling it dog is merely the sample of assimilating the animal into that child's schema about dogs. Now with accommodation, this is another type of adaptation, and this involves changing or actually altering our existing schemas in light of the information that we now have received. A process that's involving altering existing schemas or ideas would be the result of this new information or experiences. New schemas may also develop during the process. Equilibrium is what Piaget felt that all children try to strike a balance between assimilation as well as accommodation. And children basically are progressed through the stages of cognitive development utilizing this. It's important though for them to be able to maintain a balance between applying previous knowledge, which is the assimilation, and changing the behavior to be able to account for that new knowledge, which is accommodation. So equilibration would help to explain how children are able to move from one stage of thought to the next. Thus, Piaget describes cognitive disequilibrium as a stage of cognitive imbalance. Here it's where we experience states of imbalance when we're encountering new information that requires us to develop that new schema or modify existing schemas. Now, constructivism, this is when people basically produce knowledge and form meaning based upon their experiences. Piaget's theory covered learning theories, teaching methods, as well as education type of reforms, in that assimilating causes an individual to be able to incorporate new experiences from those old experiences. This is what helps makes us make sense of the world that we live in. Alright, so looking at Piaget's stages, the main development during the sensory motor stage, which is between ages 0 to approximately 2, would be that understanding that objects exist and events will occur in the world independently of one's own actions. So object permanence pretty much means knowing that an object still exists even if it's hidden. And it requires the ability to be able to formulate a mental representation, that being a schema. Now with the pre-operational stage, here this is the second stage in cognitive development, and it starts between 2 and lasts till approximately 7 years of age. And it's during this period children are thinking more symbolically, and their use of cognitive operations really is still a struggle with it. Another thing about this stage is that children go through what they call egocentrism. And that's pretty much when a kid's thoughts and their communications are typically about themselves. It's referring to that child's inability to be able to see a situation from another person's point of view. And according to Piaget, the egocentric child really assumes that other people will see, hear, feel exactly the same way as that child would feel. It's also known that in the pre-operational stage, that egocentrism will actually decline as children begin to start participating in social activities with other children. They start doing pretend play, and it starts to become more important. So it makes them think more about others. The next thing we want to know and remember is about centration, and that's that tendency to be able to focus only on one aspect of a situation at one time. So when a child can focus on more than one aspect of a situation at the same time, then they have the ability to be able to decenter. Now conservation, and I'm quite sure everybody remember what conservation is about, and that nice great old study with the infant and the ball and the blanket. But this is understanding that something stays the same in quantity, even though its appearance will change. And to be more technical, it's that ability to be able to understand that redistributing material really doesn't affect when it comes to mass, numbers, volume, or length. Then we have the concrete operational stage, and this is that third stage in Piaget's theory. And in this particular stage, a child is now showing more maturity. They're able to start using logical thought or operations like rules, but only can apply that logic to more of a physical type of entities. That's why it's called concrete operational. Now, decentration will involve that ability to be able to pay attention to those multiple attributes of an object or a particular situation, rather than being stuck on just one attribute at all. And it's through that development of decentration skills that older children will begin to pay attention more to one thing at a time. This is when multitasking will start to come into play. Now, with formal operational stage, this starts at approximately 12 years of age, and it goes into adulthood. And it's during adolescence that teenagers, they'll start to gain abilities to be able to think more abstractly in terms of being able to manipulate ideas within their head and not having to actually see it physically to be able to perform that kind of task. They won't need any kind of dependence on any kind of concrete manipulation. Now, there's a couple of videos that I will be putting on the page that shows great examples of at least conservation and object permanence. I was going to put it in a video, but as I mentioned, my video got corrupted. Well, that was the reason why. So let's take a look at some challenges as well as criticisms of Piaget's work. In terms of decollage, pretty much sometimes young children, their ability for reason is going to be more characteristic of adolescents or adults on some tasks, but then they'll perform childlike ways or immaturely in other tasks. So in other words, decollage is that invariant type of order in which a cognitive type of accomplishment would develop. There's two types of decollage that's involved, that being horizontal decollage and vertical decollage. With vertical decollage, this is that invariable sequence in which the different stages of development like sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational are when they're being attained. When you compare that with horizontal decollage, this invariant order is more about the accomplishments that would occur within that particular stage of development. So you can think about how we understand conservation of quantity is going to always be attained before understanding conservation of weight. That would come, the quantity is going to come before the weight, and that's going to be achieved before the child is able to understand volume. So you see it goes into a particular order. Now, one criticism in terms of Piaget's theory was built on the thought about how the logical, mathematical, and science is developed or utilized in this theory. We're guided by our experiences, and from those experiences, we make presumptions as well as assumptions in terms of how things should be. And that's held true with Piaget. And pretty much we know that he was a biologist at heart. So most of his theory worked on the assumption that we were all coming to be budding young scientists as we developed, and that's where we would go. But because of this, it narrowed the focus in other areas of a child's development, so it was argued. And that kind of association, making it narrow, is one of the biggest limitations of the theory itself. So because there's some limitations, and Piaget's work has been challenged over and over, there came about this new phase, that's Neo-Piagetian theorists. Okay, now they still believe in constructivism. They do assume that cognitive development can be separated within different stages, with qualitatively different type of characteristics. And they also advocate that the child's thinking is more about complex, uh, builds more complexity in advanced stages. But what's different for Neo-Piagetians compared to Piaget is the aspect of information processing being involved within each stage, and not just logic like Piaget felt. So, more or less, Neo-Piagetians they propose that it's more about the working memory and the capacity of it, and how it's affected by a biological maturation. And this will then restrict young child's ability to be able to acquire any kind of complex thinking and reasoning skills, because pretty much they really don't have it yet. And as they get older, the increase in their working memory performance is going to allow cognitive skills to develop more so, and it coincides with the timing of several different neurodevelopmental processes. And these types would include myelination, the axonal and synaptic pruning, as well as changes within the cerebral metabolism and brain activity. So myelination, particularly, it happens in waves, and it's going between birth and adolescence, and it's that degree of myelination that would impact the different areas that helps to increase the efficiency for particular skills as they get older, that including language, including ability for mobility, and so forth. So with the brain's maturation, then they feel that this happens in spurts, and that's going to affect the cognitive skills development. So besides that, they also felt that experience and learning to be able to interact during this time with biological maturation, it'll help to shape cognitive development. So now let's take a look at Jerome Bruner's theory. The major theme in this theoretical framework, which is constructivism, is about learning as an active process in which the learner, they'll be able to construct and develop new ideas or concepts that's going to be more about their past and current knowledge. They take from the here and now as well as their past experiences. And pretty much what the person who's learning will do, take they'll be selective in their information, and they'll transform that information. They'll be able to generate hypotheses, as well as come up with problem solving, and then being able to rely on the cognitive structure to do so even further. Now, this cognitive structure can be that of a schema, or if you think about mental models, this gives meaning and organization to our experiences, and this allows us to be able to go beyond what the information we receive gave, because we'll be able to take it and make associations through it and so forth. Now, when we talk about how things are taught, how we're taught things as far as instruction, a teacher would really try to encourage students to try to discover principles on their own. It's instead of me like regurgitating, I would expect that you dig deeper. I provide you with part of the information, but for you to, in order to take this in and actually learn the theories, you should be delving a little deeper. That being utilizing your reading, going into other type of avenues of research to learn more. So when you're engaged in this type of activities, or Socratic learning, pretty much Bruner felt that you'll be able to learn and your cognitive structure will be strengthened. So my task as an instructor would be able to try to translate this information that I'm giving to you so that you can be able to format it into your own state of understanding. So curriculum really needs to be organized in the terms of more of a spiral type manner so that you can continuously build upon what you have already learned. So remember, as I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, a lot of this information is not something you've never heard of before. You've gone through this in undergrad. However, now it's time for you to be able to take these theories and be able to utilize critical thinking because you've become more autonomous. You know how to delve deeper. You don't really need to rely on me to tell you what this is. You have an idea, but it's now to see how can you interact this into what your learning has become now. How can you apply it to different situations? That's that complexity that's being formulated within your cognitive structure. So Bruner also talked about how instruction really looks at 4 different aspects. That being predisposition towards learning. The second thing is the ways in which the knowledge can be structured so that you get the most from it as a learner. The third thing is talking about how to make it more effective sequentially, and be able to utilize it with present material, that application that I talked about. And then the fourth thing was usually just pacing and rewarding yourself, or punishments in terms of when you're doing good strategic methods to structure your knowledge. That should result in being able to simplify it. You'll generate new propositions. You'll increase the manipulation of your information. And when you don't, then you're losing out on that particular avenue and you're not able to gain the full understanding about what it is that you're attempting to learn. So modes of that knowledge accumulation, again, will be inactive, it can be iconic, it can be symbolic. And those new stages, again, is going to be to help add to rather than try to replace anything in those previous stages. And again, anything that's that you're attempting to learn is going to be more honest when you're within the work progress yourself. All right, so let's take a look at Egan's epistemological theory. And pretty much what he did was he offered his theory in regards to looking at things as cognitive tools as a possible replacement for some of these dominant theories that's connected to learning that helps with education. And those would include Piaget's cognitive stages, Dewey's theories about nature and goals of education, and then as well as evolutionary theory that's applied to cognitive development and learning. So he proposed that there's 5 kinds of ways of understanding these or using cognitive tools that a person usually would master in a particular order during the course of the development that reflects psychological, cultural, epistemological, tongue-tied, that's okay. But looking at the first 4 tools, he looks at somatic, mythic, romantic, and philosophical as like mirrors toward characteristics that would be in kind of timing of Piaget stages of cognitive development of sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete, and formal operations. Additionally, he proposed that there was also a 5th tool, and that's in terms of ironic understanding. Now, even though he makes mention of this, it's not really a matter of the brain's characteristics that's unfolding in a fixed type of sequence with new capacities that will come about biologically in a sequence of timing. But instead, he proposed that the various human inventions, those cognitive tools, actually develop over history, that it's kind of like passed down hereditary in some actions, and that it effectively can be introduced to children once they reach a particular level of biological maturation. However, these tools complete, as if it were, for access to children at different types of stages of development. That being, civilization was developed in concert or in a time span with training of youth in these cognitive tools over a period of time. So later down the line, different elements of the civilization, as it would be, depend more about prior implementation as well as practice with earlier elements of the information being provided. So instructors, they would actually play a role in ensuring that this new type of mode of understanding can be introduced at the specific time necessary that would have given a child sufficient practice as well as utilizing their other cognitive tools. So let's break down these four areas. That being somatic, this is occurring between 0 to 2, and the main goal in this mastery would be copying type of activities. And the main characteristics would be having a child master physical activities, that's nonverbal appreciation of the world, getting them acclimated to that. Then that second one is mythic, and this is between the ages of 3 to 7 years old approximately. Main goal for this mastery would be of developing oral language. That main characteristic is going to involve binary type of opposites within terms of thinking, utilizing metaphors, getting a child to understand stereotypes, which includes the socialization within their cultural mix, taboos, things that parents is going to naturally say, no, you can't do, yes, you can do, as well as helping them gain a sense of right and wrong. Morality kicks in at this stage. The next one will be romantic, and this is going to be between the ages of 8 to 14 approximately. And the goal in this mastery level is literacy. Here, the child will start to be able to acquire conventional skills that involve being able to get along with others, having them being able to write concise, clear, and concise, and being able to read, and to be able to gain an appreciation for finer things that they'll start to perceive and think about. And it won't be just those binary opposites that's covered within mythic understanding. And then you have the concern in terms of limits and extremes of terms of human potential in this stage. You start to wonder, how much can I really learn? How can I take this in? Am I really gathering all the information that I'm supposed to? Some independence starts to develop here as well. So now the philosophical understanding happens between ages of 15 and 20. The main goal here is to be able to master those theoretic abstractions. And it involves, being able to show concern of the world as well as knowing what your own position in the world would be. And that includes looking at those different theories. So all the facts that the person would have is coming from accruing, that romantic understanding on how they're now to be able to sort and organize into preferred type of theories of their own understanding. And as one develops these abilities, they're able to gain support from a theory with an addition to looking at relevant facts based off their experiences, based off the things that they've been taught. And they are also able to be selective and ignore things and dismiss those facts that they feel doesn't really fit in with their particular theory. Now, when we talk about ironic, this type of understanding, this is adulthood. This is from age 21 on. And at this point, you're trying to master or be able to refine reflectiveness. You're now trying to show some skepticism, not take everything for granted and think everything is true. Like the romantic understanding, you're gathering all this information and you're thinking all this information is extremely important to you. But whereas in the ironic, now you become a little bit more skeptical about different interpretations of the facts or the stories that you hear, like within human potential and so forth. So our skepticism, it ranges from extreme, like, we're just really saying, okay, look, yeah, you could tell me anything, I don't believe it. And then there's also gentle skepticism where you might be questioning. You say, okay, well, I understand what you're saying, but I wonder, can this be instead? This holds true within all aspects of life according to Egan's theory, but it's really important in terms of how we learn uh, through our educative journey. So one may argue, though, that the current trend is to be able to push literacy education uh, more toward traditionally and utilizing the mythical understanding, because it's really it can be negatively affecting the ability for children as well as adults to exercise their imaginations. The second thing is that one may be concerned about the current trends emphasizing skills-oriented education at elementary level, and that's looking really at the reading and the math. Um, and in terms of what Egan was talking about, this is more of a popular idea that would be among educational conservatives rather than what would be standard. Finally, there's one thought also is that there's too much emphasis on secondary educations in terms of giving rigorous instruction um, on logic, rational thinking, and theory testing, um, which, like what we're doing here in grad school, as well as looking at STEM programs, how it's supposed to be that greater emphasis on skeptical thinking of all sorts within post-secondary education, but we might run into some issues in which there's too much focus on that vocational preparation, not enough on critical thinking, hence not allowing you to mature not only psychologically but in terms of your cognitive development. All right, so that's Egan's theory. So with Vygotsky's theories, he stresses more about that fundamental role of social interaction in developing cognition. He proposes that community is the central role within the process of making meaning in our lives. Unlike Piaget's children's development, thoughts about children development that is necessarily precedes learning, Vygotsky's, he argued that learning is necessary and a universal aspect of our process in culturally organized development. Specifically, when we're speaking about our psychological functioning as human beings. So, social learning then is being able to perceive development. Vygotsky's developed this sociocultural approach toward cognitive development. He looked at his theory as a way of showing uh, Piaget what things should look like in terms of developing his ideas. However, he did pass at 38, so a lot of his theories are incomplete, although most of his writings are still being translated from his native language of Russian. Now, for Vygotsky, there's no single principle that would account for development. Individual development really can't be understood without being able to reference social and cultural context that's been embedded within us. So our higher mental processes for a person really comes from our social origins. let's take a look or to discuss some of the differences between Vygotsky and Piaget's work. So the first thing is Vygotsky kind of emphasizes more about culture affecting cognitive development. That definitely shows a contradiction in terms of Piaget's universal stages and content on development. Vygotsky doesn't even refer to stages in the same manner that Piaget does. With Vygotsky, he assumed that cognitive development will be varied and different across cultures. And Piaget states that cognitive development, for the most part, is universal across all cultures. Vygotsky took considerable more emphasis on those social factors that would contribute to cognitive development. He stated that cognitive development really comes from social interactions, from guided learning within the zone of proximal development as we're children, and their partners that would co-construct this knowledge. Whereas Piaget, he maintained that cognitive development really came largely from independent explorations that children would be able to construct knowledge on their own. Vygotsky seen the environment for which children grow up to be the main influencer and how they be able to think as well as what they think about. He also put more emphasis on language in terms of cognitive development. According to Piaget, language really depends on thought for its development, that being thought is coming before the language. However, with Vygotsky, he felt that thought and language kind of started off separate in the beginning of life, but would start to merge amongst each other around age 3, which would allow for verbal thought to be produced. That inner speech, being able to learn how to speak from within, so to speak, and speak your mind. Vygotsky also talks about cognitive development resulting from an internalization of that language. So, according to Vygotsky, when we're adults, it's really important, been an important source for our cognitive development, that we have been able to gather that inner speech to help us learn how to communicate, how to be able to understand based on thinking of others. Adults will transmit their cultural tools of intellectual adaptation, and that's what children will internalize. So Piaget, he kind of seen it more as peer-to-peer interactions that would help to promote social perspective taking. But all in all, both Piaget and Vygotsky did feel that infants are born with basic material abilities for intellectual development. Where Piaget focused on those motor reflexes and sensory abilities, Vygotsky looked at more of the elementary mental functioning, that being of attention, sensation, perception, memory. He did, though, eventually talk about interactions within the sociocultural environment and how it develops into a more sophisticated and more effective mental processing and being able to develop more complex strategies, which he refers to as the higher mental functions. So if an example of that would be looking at how young children's memories are, because of the biological factors, are more limited. However, culture will help to determine what type of memory strategies we develop as we get older. That being, do we start learning how to take notes to help us with memory because that's what's been shown to us, zone of proximal development. But in more pre-literate type societies, there's been other strategies that kind of show development, like being able to tie our shoestrings and being able to name off our grandparents and the grandparents before them, being able to utilize, look at large numbers and recall these large numbers and being able to repeat that. He referred to those tools of intellectual adaptation. allowing children to be able to use basic mental functions more effectively, more adaptively, as well as culturally determined. That being like mnemonics, memory mnemonics, mind maps. So Vygotsky seen cognitive functions being kind of carried out alone, as well as that affected our belief systems, our values. It helped in terms of our tools for intellectual adaptation of the culture, so that a person developed and was able to become more determined socially. And those tools of intellectual adaptation, he felt, it varied and it would be different. He showed diversity or discussed diversity from one culture to another, like in what we talked about just a moment ago in memories. So that's Vygotsky, that's Lev in a nutshell. And of course, his writings was quite more extensive. And even though he passed away at a young age, there's still so much work that they rely on from him. Now, when we look at reading, there's different skill levels that we attempt to attain. Those being decoding, morphemes, comprehension, trying to learn how to communicate and learn how to understand what's being communicated to us. So decoding is that basic function to be able to learn the written aspect of language. We're taught to use our consonants, our vowels, how to develop our speech patterns. Unless you have a speech impediment like myself, then you have to continuously work at it. However, when we figure out that construction and have comprehension, we then can build on our vocabulary that's either going to be whole words and or by using a whole language. Depending on the language that you utilize, for some items, the words have to be broken down. You look at the vowels, you look at the consonants, and you break it down and how to pronounce each and every one, going into our phonics. So we use that to the point that it helps us to become more automatic when we are using words that we've learned already, as well as how we go about learning new words. At least that's what it's hoped to be, that we gain a balanced type of literacy, that of being able to have a set of vocabulary you can convey information to, and then the ability to be able to increase your vocabulary without the dependence of others teaching you. So with writing, to be talk about what the expert feels, our writing should allow us to be able to generate new ideas, new theories, and be able to help us to outline a hypothesis. One of the things that we have to do for ourselves, and to be quite honest, a lot of us do not like to do it, is what we talk about in revision. The revision process not only makes sure that you're grammatically correct, but it also reinforces the idea that you're attempting to present. It stands for and allows for greater cohesion and a flow. I'll never forget, I had in grad school one instructor, she just said to me, well, Teresa, I have to say this. I understand everything that you've written. However, it comes across awkward. And it's something I had to work on because it was like awkward. I usually flipped words. Sometimes I thought maybe it was I had the dyslexia and didn't realize it, but it was just awkward writing. I've improved that through planning out and brainstorming and using outlines and writing things out and trying to make sure, because we all seem to have this habit of writing the way we speak, although the construction of a sentence would be more than not different than how you would actually say it aloud. So we have to do extensive planning. We have to provide structure. There should be a sequence of flow of things. Uh, I had one instructor in undergrad that really helped me a lot with my writing. at least she gave me a foothold. And although by the time I was in grad school, I still sounded awkward, my writing was much more improved than when I was an undergrad. Later on down the line, I kept working at it and practicing on my own, and to the point where I can write eloquently, more so than I can speak eloquently. But this is where we provide ourselves with that instruction and coming up with strategies to be more effective in being able to communicate. That meaning, a lot of times, particularly in our field of psychology, you'll hear these two words continuously throughout. If you're submitting a report, if you are writing an article for a journal, the words are clear and concise. Be to the point. We tend to want to make things, really sound creative and poetic to the point where we add a lot of fluff. And that's what I discovered in what the instructor meant when she was saying it's awkward. I put too much flour into that cake mix, so to speak, and it kind of made it spongy instead of clear cut, and we want to cut into it right away. So those are some areas in terms of what we need to look for in when we're speaking about writing. So now we're going to talk about Bloom and the work he did with gifted children or talented children. He's seen these children as prodigies. And prodigies meaning that, they demonstrated high levels of proficiency and efficiency in academic arenas. And some of the different facets that attributed to this, Bloom felt, was the initial aptitude, the amount of time that they invested to children was encouraged, as well as participated on their own, and long hours of practice. What comes to mind is when I think of these children who do the spelling bees and the amount of time and effort that they put in to the work, to learning all the different words that they use and hopefully win spelling bees with. But it does also include family involvement, the involvement of teachers, people to coach them through it, and different realms in that aspect to help shape what a prodigy becomes. Now, Bloom's taxonomy, he pretty much was a leader in terms of education. But what he did was he promoted these higher forms of thinking in education, like analyzing, being able to evaluate different concepts, looking at how we process, the procedures that we use, and the principles that goes with the different theories behind them. And instead of just allowing someone to remember facts, which we know is rote learning, we really have to learn how to design and create educational type learning experiences in which the information has more meaning and we're able to relay it with more than just the average definition. So Bloom felt that there's actually 3 domains to learning. That being where it helps with our activities and learning. It looks at our cognitive, which would be those mental skills that helps us to attain knowledge. Affective, that's for growth and feelings of emotional areas, that's going to help us in learning based upon our experiences. And then psychomotor, creating manual and physical skills and developing those. And since that work was produced through more or less where we are right now, higher education, most times this information is presented with vocabulary that is more complex. And if you are a prodigy or a child, then these children are able to attend to it. One of the things I used to love to brag about was my middle son, because at the age of 3 he was able to read the New York Times and understood what he read. And it was like, I don't recall such big effort on our part. Yes, we worked with him with the preschool type information, but to see him actually pick up the newspaper and read, he read a paragraph, and I'm like, well, what does that mean? And he explained it. That was a boggle for my mind. But anyway, we need to think about these domains in terms of categories. Think of it as a way of designing and allowing us to pick the things that we need in order to be able to gain the information correctly, be able to interpret that information, which is the knowledge and that cognitive skill, uh, that is, as well as the attitude we have behind it. And it's going to represent those three of cognitive, affective, as well as psychomotor. So the taxonomy of learning really is thought as goals of how we go about the learning process. Looking at it as a episode, so to speak, just like when we watch a movie episode, or when you listen to different lectures and it's sequentially created and done. It's those steps that we'll take to develop a new skill. All right, so this is where I'm stopping at this point of the chapter. These are the main things I wanted to talk about. In regards to strategies, learning strategies, practicing, and so forth, that's what I'm going to leave for you to complete in the chapter on your own. Please start prepping yourself. We are getting coming toward the final week. Uh, these 8 weeks went really quick. So I will be giving one more lecture next week, as well as review of practice exams like we did at the midterm point. If you have not completed your assignments, I implore you to please do so. Uh, it does make a difference in terms of grades. So it's really important that you complete all your assignments. I have some people who they've gotten ahead and was able to do most of their assignments, and that's wonderful. But if you are finding yourself still behind, please make sure that you complete all your assignments so that you have a fighting chance for a good grade. Other than that, it's a wrap. Have a good rest of your week. Talk to you soon.